Before we dive into the countdown, a quick note. Nicolas Maduro's story is full of twists. From a humble start to an arrest using United States Special Forces troops to an international trial. So we thought you might want to know a little bit more about this man who has caught the attention of the entire world. In this video, we'll count down 10 interesting facts about Maduro and the struggles of Venezuela, many of which aren't common knowledge. We'll go from number 10 to number 1, so stick around for the most jaw-dropping fact at the end. 10. From bus driver to president. Believe it or not, Nicolas Maduro wasn't groomed from birth to be a politician. He literally started as a bus driver. In his early 20s, Maduro found work driving buses for Caracas's public transit and became a union activist for transit workers. This humble beginning gave him street credibility as a man of the people, and it also sparked his interest in politics. Maduro's father was a prominent trade union leader as well, so activism ran in the family. Maduro's formal education was very limited. He never attended college. In fact, the only post-high school study he did was a one-year political training in communist Cuba in 1986. That ideological boot camp in Havana was his crash course in socialism and revolution. After returning to Venezuela, Maduro fully embraced the movement of Hugo Chavez, the fiery army colonel leading a socialist uprising. He transitioned from driving buses to driving political change, rising through the ranks of Chavez's party as a loyal supporter. Fun fact, Maduro is an avid fan of classic rock, especially John Lennon's music, and often preaches about peace and love, in an ironic twist given the turmoil of his presidency. 9. Chavez's protege and a little bird blessing. Maduro wasn't just any politician in Venezuela. He was handpicked by President Hugo Chavez to be his successor. Chavez, who led Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution, trusted Maduro deeply, appointing him foreign minister in 2006 and then vice president in 2012. When Chavez was dying of cancer in 2013, he publicly anointed Maduro as the heir to carry on his socialist mission. This was a big reason Maduro clinched the presidency after Chavez's death, riding a wave of sympathy in Chavez's endorsement. Maduro's devotion to Chavez took some mystical turns. He famously claimed that Chavez's spirit visited him in the form of a tiny bird during the 2013 presidential campaign. According to Maduro's tale, a little bird flew around his head, and he felt it was Chavez giving him a blessing to win the election. He even whistled at the bird, and it whistled back before flying off, leaving Maduro convinced he had Chavez's spiritual endorsement. Yes, you heard that right. Venezuela's president went on TV and earnestly recounted a Disney-esque chat with Chavez the bird. Many Venezuelans found this story somewhere between inspiring and absurd. Maduro leaned into Chavez's mythos heavily. He often invoked Chavez's legacy, and apparently his ghostly avian form, to boost his own legitimacy. Despite criticism and jokes about the little bird incident, this anecdote shows how Maduro cultivated almost religious reverence around Chavez's memory. It was an attempt to keep the Chavez magic alive and to remind people that Chavez chose him. In the end, that legacy was a double-edged sword. It gave Maduro a base of die-hard Chavistas, but it also set expectations he couldn't live up to as Venezuela's crises worsened. 8. Family ties. The First Lady and the narco nephews. Nicolas Maduro's inner circle wasn't limited to party comrades. Family is key in his story too. His wife, Celia Flores, is not a typical First Lady. She's a seasoned political operator who once led Venezuela's National Assembly. Known as First Combatant, Flores has been one of Maduro's closest advisors and power brokers. But having family deeply involved in politics also brought Maduro a major scandal that many outside Venezuela never heard about: the narco nephews affair. In 2015, two of Celia Flores' nephews, by blood, they're essentially Maduro's step-nephews, were arrested by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration in a stunning drug bust. The young men were caught in Haiti with a whopping 800 kilograms of cocaine that they planned to smuggle into the United States. Talk about family troubles. They were literally trying to put tons of cocaine on U.S. streets. This became known as the Narco Sobrinos scandal. narco-nephews in Spanish. In 2017, a U.S. federal court convicted both nephews and sentenced them to 18 years in prison. Prosecutors even argued that the drug money they sought would help keep their family, Maduro and Flores, in power. This was a huge embarrassment for Maduro. It painted a picture of high-level corruption and drug ties reaching right into the presidential family. Maduro, of course, disowned the nephew's actions and said it was a U.S. plot to tarnish him. But the damage was done. The incident reinforced suspicions that people in Maduro's circle were knee-deep in the drug trade. Celia Flores herself was not charged, but the episode earned her the unflattering nickname, First Lady of Drugs, in some media. It's a dramatic example of how Venezuela's regime has been accused of behaving more like a cartel than a government, with even relatives caught in the act. 7. Economic collapse and the Maduro diet. It's no secret that Venezuela's economy has been in freefall, but the scale of the collapse under Maduro is still hard to fathom. Once one of Latin America's richest countries, Venezuela spiraled into an economic nightmare during Maduro's presidency. By 2020, the economy had shrunk by about 71% from its size in 2012, essentially wiping out decades of growth in a few years. Inflation went berserk, at one point exceeding hundreds of thousands of percent annually. Yes, 6 digits. Money became almost worthless, with prices doubling every few weeks or even days at the peak of hyperinflation. For ordinary Venezuelans, this meant extreme shortages of food, medicine, fuel, and basic necessities. Supermarket shelves were empty, and people waited in line for hours for a loaf of bread or a bit of cooking oil. By 2017, Venezuelans were literally starving so badly that the average adult lost over 20 pounds in body weight due to hunger and malnutrition. This grim phenomenon was darkly nicknamed the Maduro diet, a diet no one wanted where families cut meals and kids went hungry. Maduro once quipped that being chubby was unhealthy, which people took as tone-deaf justification for their hunger pangs. The humanitarian toll has been immense. Diseases that were once under control surged because hospitals lacked supplies. Millions of children faced malnutrition. Over 5 million Venezuelans fled the country in the largest refugee exodus ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. It's like the entire population of a large city just left. Families walking across borders with what little they had. This mass migration was driven by desperation as much as repression. Neighboring countries like Colombia and Peru were overwhelmed by refugees. The collapse of the oil industry, which was Venezuela's lifeblood, and rampant corruption under Maduro's watch exacerbated the crisis. In short, Venezuelans suffered one of the worst economic meltdowns in modern history, something many observers blame squarely on Maduro's mismanagement, authoritarian policies, and yes, massive corruption. While Maduro's government liked to blame U.S. sanctions for the pain, economists note that the freefall began long before sanctions tightened. For the Venezuelan people, these years have been a tragic struggle for survival, a side of Maduro's legacy that cannot be ignored. 6. Protests, crackdowns, and crimes against humanity. With living conditions in ruins, it's no surprise that Venezuelans rose up in anger. Mass protests against Nicolas Maduro's government have been a recurring scene since he took office. Early in his rule in 2014, students and opposition groups hit the streets protesting food shortages, soaring prices, and authoritarian crackdowns. Maduro responded with force. He leaned heavily on the military and police to crush protests with brute force, tear gas, rubber bullets, and even live ammunition in some cases. In 2017, during months of daily demonstrations, over 100 people were killed in street clashes with pro-Maduro security forces. Thousands more were arrested or injured. International human rights organizations and the United Nations started sounding the alarm. They accused Maduro's security forces of torture, arbitrary detentions, and even extrajudicial killings of political opponents. The evidence of abuses became so alarming that the International Criminal Court opened an investigation in 2018 into possible crimes against humanity in Venezuela. This was historic. Never before had a South American government been subject to an ICC probe while still in power. It signaled that the world viewed Venezuela's crackdown as more than just typical authoritarianism. It potentially rose to the level of serious international crimes. Maduro has insisted he's defending Venezuela from violent coup plotters, often labeling protesters as terrorists or pawns of U.S. imperialism. In one dramatic incident in August 2018, a drone loaded with explosives detonated near Maduro during a military parade, an apparent assassination attempt that injured several soldiers. Maduro blamed right-wing plotters and even Colombian conspirators for the drone attack. His government used such incidents to justify further crackdowns, claiming there were constant attempts on his life. Whether on the streets or from the skies, Maduro has faced threats, but each time he tightened his grip. Over the years, Venezuelan jails filled up with political prisoners, from student activists to opposition leaders. The UN documented horrific torture methods used on detainees. These abuses further delegitimized Maduro in the eyes of many countries. By portraying all dissent as a foreign-backed coup, Maduro gave himself cover to smother dissent with an iron fist, at a terrible cost to human life and democracy. 5. A Tale of Two Presidents. One of the most bizarre chapters in Maduro's rule is that for a while Venezuela had two claimants to the presidency. In January 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaidó, then head of the National Assembly, invoked the Constitution to declare himself interim president, arguing that Maduro's 2018 re-election was fraudulent. In an almost unprecedented diplomatic drama, over 50 countries around the world, including the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe, recognized Guaidó as the legitimate president of Venezuela. They viewed Maduro as an usurper who stole the election. This left Venezuela in a strange limbo. Maduro still controlled the presidential palace, the military, and the airwaves, but Guaidó was recognized on the international stage and tried to rally support at home. For Maduro, this was a serious crisis of legitimacy. Dozens of nations severed ties with his government. He responded by doubling down, expelling American diplomats, arresting Guaidó's allies, and rallying his own supporters with fiery anti-imperialist rhetoric. "I have not been made president by the U.S. or any foreign power," Maduro proclaimed at his inauguration for the disputed term. "My power comes from the people." Despite those words, much of the Venezuelan people in the world had their doubts. So why didn't Guaidó's parallel presidency succeed internally? Largely because Maduro kept the loyalty of the military and security forces. He controlled the state institutions and had the guns, a decisive factor. Meanwhile, Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, and a few others backed Maduro and condemned what they called a U.S.-orchestrated coup. The military top brass stuck with Maduro. Many had lucrative positions and were implicated in corruption, so they feared change. By 2020, the momentum behind Guaidó stalled. Protests waned, and the opposition found itself frustrated. However, the standoff further isolated Maduro diplomatically. His government was hit with heavy economic sanctions and became a pariah in much of the world. At the UN, multiple countries refused to recognize Maduro's ambassadors. Internally, while Guaidó's challenge eventually faded, the opposition splintered, Maduro emerged more isolated but still in power, thanks to his security forces' backing and his international allies' support. The world basically witnessed a showdown of legitimacy versus raw power, and for the time being, power won out in Caracas. 4. Friends in high places and crypto experiments. Despite being ostracized by many Western countries, Maduro wasn't without powerful friends. Key international allies kept his regime afloat. Perhaps most importantly, Cuba provided crucial intelligence and security assistance. Cuban advisors helped Maduro's government with everything from counterintelligence to sniff out plots to healthcare by sending Cuban doctors. Russia became a lifeline too, supplying military equipment, loans, and oil drilling expertise. Russian firms even helped Venezuela circumvent oil sanctions by covertly shipping and selling Venezuelan crude. China pumped in billions of dollars over the years in loans and investments, although it scaled back as Venezuela's economy imploded. These alliances weren't just ideological, they were Maduro's survival strategy. They gave him diplomatic cover and economic oxygen when U.S. sanctions tightened the noose. Maduro also got some help from more rogue actors. For instance, Iran stepped in to deliver fuel and refinery parts when Venezuela's own oil infrastructure broke down in 2020. And regionally, countries like Turkey and some Caribbean nations maintained ties. This meant Maduro could still trade gold, oil, and other resources through back channels, mitigating some effects of international sanctions. One of the more creative, if dubious ways Maduro tried to beat the sanctions was by launching the world's first state-backed cryptocurrency. In 2018, he introduced the Petro, a Venezuelan cryptocurrency supposedly backed by the country's oil reserves. Maduro touted the Petro as kryptonite to defeat Superman, Superman being the U.S. in his analogy. The idea was to raise cash and let Venezuela trade internationally via blockchain, bypassing U.S. banks. While it was a milestone as the first national crypto, most experts call the Petro a flop. Few investors bought it, and it never became a usable currency. In fact, reports suggested the Venezuelan government exaggerated Petro's success, and independent analysts found almost no real transactions on its ledger. It ended up more of a gimmick than a cure for the collapsing economy. Despite these efforts, by 2025, Venezuela was basically cut off from global financial systems. But thanks to allies like Russia, China, and Iran, Maduro managed to hang on. They provided just enough money, trade, and support for him to weather the storm. This foreign backing is something many casual observers might not know about. Maduro didn't survive in a vacuum. Geopolitics played a huge role in propping him up, even as millions of Venezuelans suffered under economic isolation. It's a reminder that in international politics, having friends, even authoritarian ones, can keep a sinking ship just barely afloat. 3. The Cartel of the Suns, Maduro's narco connection. Here's a truly explosive aspect of Maduro's regime that many people are unaware of. U.S. authorities allege that Maduro and his top officials didn't just tolerate drug trafficking. They ran an entire drug cartel from within the Venezuelan state. It's called the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles, named after the sun insignia that Venezuelan military generals wear. Over the years, Venezuelan generals, politicians, and even judges have been accused of helping smuggle massive quantities of cocaine and other drugs out of Venezuela. And at the top of this alleged narco empire, the U.S. says, is Nicolas Maduro himself. According to U.S. indictments in the State Department, Maduro ultimately managed and led the Cartel of the Suns. They say that as he gained power, he entered into a corrupt and violent narco-terrorism conspiracy with Colombia's FARC guerrillas, who were not just insurgents but major cocaine producers. Under Maduro's watch, Venezuela became a safe haven and highway for drug trafficking. Some of the eyebrow-raising accusations include that Maduro and his cohorts, he shipped multi-ton loads of cocaine via air and sea routes from Venezuelan territory in partnership with the FARC. The goal, to, in the words of U.S. officials, flood the United States with cocaine. He provided military-grade weapons to the FARC rebel army in exchange for cuts of the drug profits, essentially arming guerrillas next door as part of a cocaine for weapons partnership. He used Venezuela's military and security forces to protect drug shipments and even directly coordinate trafficking operations. High-ranking officers allegedly turned the Venezuelan armed forces into escorts for narco shipments. He trained and funded a special paramilitary unit, an unsanctioned militia, to act as an armed wing of the cartel, effectively a narco army operating under the state's nose. The U.S. government alleges these activities went on for years, all directed by Maduro and men like his second-in-command Diosdado Cabello, who's often named as a key cartel figure. In March 2020, the U.S. formally charged Maduro with narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and related weapons charges in an indictment out of New York. It was a bombshell, a sitting head of state accused of being a drug kingpin. U.S. prosecutors assert that Maduro used cocaine as a weapon against America's public health while enriching himself and his cronies. Maduro naturally denied all this and dismissed it as a fabrication. But over time, pieces of evidence have emerged. For example, Maduro's own former intelligence chief, General Hugo Carvajal, was arrested and later flipped in U.S. custody, providing insider information on the regime's drug ties. And remember those narco nephews from fact number 8? They were just the tip of the iceberg. This narco dimension is one of the most interesting and dangerous things about Maduro's rule. It suggests Venezuela wasn't just experiencing a political and economic crisis, but was also hijacked by a criminal enterprise. It's a facet of Maduro's legacy that directly led to the U.S. seeking to put him on trial, which brings us to our final 2 points. 2. $15 million bounty and a daring extradition. By the mid-2020s, Nicolas Maduro had become one of the most wanted men in the world, at least in the eyes of the U.S. government. In 2020, when the U.S. Justice Department indicted Maduro on those narco-terrorism charges, the U.S. State Department went so far as to put a bounty on his head, initially offering $15 million for information leading to Maduro's arrest. Later, as the case intensified, U.S. officials raised the reward to $50 million, an almost unheard of sum, on par with what was offered for the world's most notorious terrorists. For context, that's the same ballpark as the bounty once placed on Osama bin Laden. It shows how badly U.S. authorities wanted Maduro in custody. For a few years, this seemed mostly symbolic. Maduro was holed up in Caracas, guarded by loyal troops and shielded by international allies. But things took a stunning turn in late 2025. With geopolitical winds shifting, the United States took bold action. In early January 2026, U.S. Special Forces launched a covert raid in Caracas and captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife in a dramatic operation. This wasn't a quiet legal extradition. It was a military-style extraction that Maduro's supporters likened to a kidnapping. U.S. President Donald Trump, who had returned to office in 2025, announced that American forces had conducted a large-scale strike and flown Maduro out of Venezuela to face justice. The world was stunned. Scenes that felt ripped from an action movie unfolded as Maduro was whisked away on a U.S. military aircraft. Maduro had reportedly been hiding in a fortress-like safe house, but apparently intelligence, and possibly some inside betrayal, gave him away. Within hours, he found himself on a U.S. Navy ship headed north to Guantanamo Bay, and then a jet to New York. This unilateral U.S. action on foreign soil was controversial. Some called it an illegal intervention, but it achieved what sanctions and diplomacy could not. Maduro in chains. In New York, crowds of Venezuelan exiles actually cheered when they heard the news, celebrating what they saw as the downfall of a dictator. In Caracas, however, there were pockets of anger and protest among remaining Maduro loyalists, and the Venezuelan government, what was left of it, declared the raid a violation of sovereignty. It's worth noting how historic this moment is. The last time the U.S. forcibly brought a sitting head of state to face American courts was Manuel Noriega of Panama in 1989, during the Panama invasion. The Maduro operation drew immediate comparisons to that event. The U.S. essentially decided that Maduro's alleged crimes were so egregious, and efforts to remove him through other means had failed, that it took matters into its own hands. Love or hate the approach, it's one of the most dramatic turns in recent international politics, and it set the stage for an even more dramatic trial. 1. Trial in New York. Maduro faces American justice now for the grand finale. Nicolas Maduro is on trial in the United States, a phrase that was unimaginable just a few weeks ago. After his capture, Maduro was promptly flown to New York, where he is now facing a U.S. federal court. The charges? Everything we discussed in fact number 3 and then some. Officially, Maduro has been indicted on narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine into the U.S., possession of deadly weapons, machine guns, in furtherance of drug crimes and money laundering. In plain terms, U.S. prosecutors accuse him of using his position as Venezuela's leader to operate a massive cocaine trafficking scheme that pumped drugs into American cities, all while partnering with Colombian terrorists, FARC, and profiting from corruption. It's a jaw-dropping indictment, treating a former president like a cartel boss. Maduro has said he is not guilty, and he dismisses the trial as a political witch hunt. But the U.S. Department of Justice seems confident in its case. They have years' worth of investigative evidence, including testimonies from insiders. Remember Hugo Carvajal, the ex-spy chief? He's expected to be a star witness, having cut a deal and provided intel on Maduro's drug operations. U.S. attorneys say Maduro's regime flooded the U.S. with cocaine deliberately, and they're treating it as a national security matter. This trial is making headlines worldwide. It's extremely rare for a head of state to be tried in a U.S. court. It puts Maduro in a select and notorious club with Panama's Noriega and perhaps Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who was indicted in absentia. For many Venezuelans, seeing Maduro in a defendant's chair in New York is surreal justice. They blame him for ruining their country, and now he's finally being held to account outside Venezuela's politicized courts. For Maduro's supporters and allied governments, though, it's proof of American overreach. They argue the U.S. had no right to extradite a sovereign leader by force. As of now, Maduro is being held in a high-security facility in New York, far from the presidential palace he once occupied. The trial is expected to delve into gritty details of Venezuelan corruption, drug deals, and even ties to foreign militants. If convicted on the narco-terrorism charges alone, Maduro could face a sentence of up to life in U.S. prison, effectively ending any hope of a return to his previous stature. It's a dramatic fall for a bus driver turned president who once promised to continue Chavez's revolution. In summary, the United States pushed for Maduro's extradition and trial because of the massive drug trafficking and crimes they allege he committed. The trial is about holding him responsible for turning a country into a criminal enterprise that sent narcotics across borders. It's also partly about sending a message that no one, not even a president, is above the law when it comes to drug terrorism. These 10 facts barely scratch the surface of his tumultuous reign and Venezuela's plight, but they shed light on the lesser-known aspects of a former president who went from obscure union leader to international headline. It's a story still unfolding, with Maduro's trial ongoing and Venezuelans hoping for a brighter chapter ahead. Thank you for watching, and now you know a lot more about Nicolas Maduro than most people ever did. If you found this informative, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into global events. Until next time, hasta luego.